Democracy is sometimes an unhappy word because it is understood differently. I am happy to be present here in Nigeria this afternoon. I'm happy because this is celebrated as the Day of Democracy. And I'm informed that throughout the 36 states of Nigeria, there is some activity which is deliberately designed to celebrate democracy. Democracy is sometimes an unhappy word because it is understood differently. But permit me to say that throughout my intervention, my understanding of democracy will mean a government that acknowledges people's participation, a government that guarantees that our people are given the opportunity from a standpoint of enlightenment to elect into office men and women who will serve them as servants rather than masters. If that is what democracy is, it also gladdens my heart to be in the presence of a man who at a critical time in the history of the Federal Republic of Nigeria did something that in my view has not been sufficiently celebrated in Nigeria. General Abdulsalami Abubakar. At a time when Africa and African countries were infamous for individuals who would want to hold office forever, you gave up office. At a time when many skeptics and many cynics thought that you would stay on, you said, I would not stay on. At a time when many had written the obituary of Nigeria, you created a situation that facilitated the peaceful transfer of power. And you may or may not know, it is because of that simple act that at critical moments in Nigeria's history, even when there is the appetite for individuals to stay in office, they remember your act and they leave office because they know that they will be judged alongside you. May God bless you. He will bless you because you did something that planted or replanted the tree of democracy in Nigeria and sent a clear message to the world and to Nigerians that one can do that which is in the best interest of his or our country. Today, therefore, as we are assembled here to celebrate you, because as the saying goes, when a person has gold in his hand, sometimes he thinks he has copper. Nigerians, you have gold in your hands, pretty much such. We are assembled here in Nigeria at a time when Africa is still interrogating democracy. And in order to understand and appreciate democracy, we must remind ourselves that the African continent as we know her today, divided as she is into 54 states, is a continent that continues to underperform. She is a continent whose sons and daughters on the dawn of independence promised many things. One must also remember that only on the 25th day of May, we celebrated Africa Day. we celebrated that day because on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, 32 heads of states and government who were representing the countries that had regained their independence assembled. And each one of them, without exception on that day, made a solemn vow that Africa, having unchained ourselves from the shackles of colonization, would move on a different trajectory. On that day, the leaders said that in order for Africa to immunize ourselves against the diabolical machinations of the former colonizers, Africa had to unite. They said that. On that day, they reminded themselves that if Africa and her sons and daughters were to realize their potential, their economic circumstances would have to be improved. They reminded themselves on that day that Africa needed to address the critical areas of the society so that the dividends of democracy can be earned. But several years down the line, in many countries in Africa, even in countries where we celebrate democracy, there are many who say it was better while we waited. They say so because there is a sense in which the promise or the promises that were made have not been delivered. In a manner of speaking, if you allow me to be dramatic, we were promised an elephant, and many times we have delivered to us a rabbit. And that is what then legitimizes our interrogation of democracy. In the last few years, those who are our colonizers and those who in many ways continue to want to dominate our affairs have wanted to dictate to us what democracy is. They have wanted to tell us, and they have told us, that democracy means that you must have periodic elections. And there is nothing wrong with periodic elections. They have wanted to tell us, and indeed they have told us, that democracy equals to multi-party politics. And I know countries in Africa where we have over 233 political parties. There is a sense in which they want to tell us how to run our affairs. But today, as we interrogate what democracy is, I want to suggest to this audience that democracy must be understood contextually, and that there is no one-size-fits democracy. In other words, I'm saying that democracy only has a critical DNA, and that DNA is people participation. In other words, at all critical moments when we claim that there is democracy, we must ensure that the will of the people is expressed. I remember as a young student reading about a Latin American leader known as Somoza. And it is recorded that during an election, he said to the one who had actually won the election, and the man told him, "I won the vote," he said, "but you did not win the count." I am suggesting to us that Africa must give practical meaning to democracy, where the vote of the people is given its pride of place. Because history has demonstrated not once, not twice, but times without number, that when our people are invested in their governance system, then they will protect it with their life. And if they protect it with their life, then they will ensure that the democracy that they are talking about is not a democracy that is only designed to satisfy the appetite of those who are in positions of leadership, but it is the kind of democracy that is designed to address this generation and generations yet to be born. We are suggesting, therefore, that it is fitting and right for Nigeria and indeed any nation to interrogate their brand of democracy. I have come to Nigeria at a time when every other governor, and indeed His Excellency the President of Nigeria, are around and about trying to interrogate their first year in office. In other words, they are coming back to the people and asking themselves, have we delivered on the promises that we made to the people? And I want to suggest to Nigeria that that is a good thing. When leaders or those in positions of leadership have a sense of guilt and they have a sense of responsibility to the people that they govern, that is the beginning of the development and the growth of democracy. What is happening in Nigeria today, therefore, is a good thing. When I listen to governors from different states of Nigeria saying, you elected me on the basis of a manifesto, and I'm suggesting and I'm showing you that on the basis of that manifesto, we have started a journey, that is a good thing. When I see the governor of Borno, and we have had a conversation, he'll be leaving very shortly, he wants to go back to Borno to tell those who elected him, you elected me 1 year ago and I've started the race because, as they say in the Kiswahili language, a cock or a chick that will grow into a cock is seen on the day that it hatches. And your ladyship, it is also true of a chick that will grow into a hen. And it is also true that a good day is seen in the morning. So the whole idea of interrogating democracy in Nigeria is a good thing. But it must be said that democracy is a culture that must be inculcated in the minds and hearts of a people. I remember a lady who was once the president of Philippines, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, once said that if you call democracy a practice where people vote without knowing what they are voting for, or when people vote because of tribe or religion, that is not democracy, that is a confederation of fools. I'm suggesting to us that in order to have proper democracy, we must be informed by only one desire. We must be informed by the desire to ensure that the countries that we live in are led by men and women who are blind to our differences, men and women who are blind to the distinguishing factors which only divide us. Because as the saying goes, he is not a Democrat, he or she who appeals to primordial ethnic sentiments or religious sentiments. We must, as a people, recognize that our diversity is our strength. And I want to suggest to us that, as the famous Kenyan Ali Mazrui said, Africa has distinguished herself, that in the midst of the disruption that she has suffered, because you and remember, Africa suffered the pain of slavery and we withstood that. Africa suffered the pain of colonization and we withstood that. Africa is reeling from the pain of neo-colonization and we are withstanding that. African countries withstood the pain of arbitrary partition in Berlin in 1884, and peoples of different cultures were put together. But even in the midst of our diversity, somehow we continue to thrive. Let us not judge ourselves too harshly. Sometimes I fear that in Africa we judge ourselves too harshly. But what is 62 years, what is 67 years when your life had been disrupted for 100 years? What is 50 years when you had been confused? What is 50 years or 60 years when a dominant power came into your midst and their declared policy was divide, conquer, and rule, and you are trying to liberate yourself from their conquest, and they appear to have gone and they have not gone? Let us not judge ourselves too harshly. Africa has been victimized. and victimized in many ways. Victimized by prescriptions which do not sit well with the realities of the continent of Africa. Africa has been victimized by institutions which were alien. John Henry Clark, that famous American civil rights, when asked about governance in Africa, said that one of the problems of the continent of Africa was that when her countries regained their independence, not a single one of them adopted systems that can be described as African. What they did was to inherit governance systems that were bequeathed to them by their colonizers. And this was his verdict, that unless they adopt and adapt, they will never succeed on the basis of those borrowed systems. Because a coat that is borrowed does not sit well on your shoulders. I'm suggesting to us that Africa must now redefine what democracy means in the context of the realities of Africa. We must agree that there is a DNA which is dominant. We must agree that that DNA, as I said at the very beginning, is one that requires people participation. We must agree that that DNA is a DNA that requires that leadership must be changed, that young blood must replace young blood, old blood, periodically, that new ideas must replace old ideas.